Good morning. Thank you for coming. My name is Peggy Seidel. I'm the president of the Friends of the Montana Historical Society. We are sponsoring the lecture today. Our lecture is Sedition, Suffrage, Sobriety, Montana's Extraordinary Session of 1918. Our speaker is Rich Aarstad. Did I pronounce that correctly? Rich is from Libby, Montana. He attended the University of Montana and received a Bachelor's of Art in 1997 and an MA in 2000. His master's thesis was on Montana's other strike, the 1917 World War I timber strike in the Kootenai Valley. Aarstad was hired at Montana Historical Society in 2001 as a Lewis and Clark reference historian. His current position is senior archivist at MHS. His wife, Kim, grew up in Troy, Montana, and works as the business manager for the East Helena School District. Rich and his wife, I'm assuming, have one child that lives in Spokane.
We borrowed him.
And two of the cutest granddaughters in the world. And you pronounce their names.
Chesney and Cashlin.
Those are cute.
I spent 15 minutes on the phone with them yesterday as they made faces at me. It was great.
Oh, FaceTiming?
Yeah, they FaceTimed me.
Yep. And this is the last sentence here. He has a shotgun.
I have two granddaughters. I have a shotgun.
Rich, thank you.
So, the oldest one came to visit us last summer, and I decided that I needed to. I'm going to wrestle with this thing running, so it's going to look great on video. I decided I needed to take her to Dairy Queen. So I took her to Dairy Queen, and we're sitting there and enjoying our ice cream, and this woman comes in with two boys, and one of them is about Chesney's age, and he sits down over there, and he starts eyeballing her. And she does too, and finally I leaned over and I said, you know, Grandpa has a license to kill. So, she's 9. Yeah, so I have a license to kill. It's probably not a good thing to say. Don't record that, Renee. That's not good. But I bought one for my son too, so we are prepared. It's always very nice to come here and speak to the Friends group, because it's like speaking to family. So typically no nerves, which is a good thing. So I did get my coffee down, so I shouldn't, do a crocodile yawn or anything like that. Presentation today is Seed, Sedition, Suffrage, and Sobriety. Essentially, it was inspired by an article that I read online called Thinking Historically, A Guide to Strategy and Statecraft by Francis J. Gavin. And in that article, he quoted former Secretary of State Sandy Berger, National Security Advisor, who wrote, "History is written through a rear-view mirror, but unfolds through a foggy windshield." And I thought, wow, that's pretty appropriate. And so we were starting to ramp up for the centennial of the U.S. entry into World War I, and it seemed fitting to apply that to this topic as well. And so the special session in 1918 wasn't something that I had taken a long look at, but once I did, I thought it would be interesting to take a look at it through the lens that Stewart had, Governor Sam Stewart had at the time, and maybe look at some of the events that were unfolding in Montana that inspired him or drove him, regardless of how it turned out, to call that special session and promote the legislation that they did at the time. So with your indulgence, we're going to attempt to fog the windshield and figure out exactly what was obscuring his vision at the time and steering him towards that special session. And the other interesting thing about that is, you hear all the time that, if you don't pay attention to your history, you're bound to repeat it and all that kind of good stuff. And as I was putting this together last year, it was during the NFL season, and the whole issue of stand or kneel, free speech or, being unpatriotic, that whole scenario started to unfold, and it's very similar to what was unfolding at the same time. I'm going to blame that on the tech guy. So we're just going to put it to sleep for 4 hours, okay? That'll be coming out of your pay, Renan. So the war wasn't a surprise by any means. I mean, it started in Europe in 1914. The sides chose up and they started a shooting war. The United States declared its neutrality very early on and essentially planned to stay out of the war. But there had been things afoot for a number of years, you could actually say decades, in the country that would help promote the war hysteria that we view now when we look back at it. And you know, Sam Stewart was no stranger to most of that, having been the county attorney in Madison County and involved in Democratic politics in the state pretty much from the time he arrived until he was elected governor in 1912. And so by the time he's elected governor in 1912, he's already seen several large violent labor disputes in the state. Of course, Butte's always been a labor dispute, and probably always will be. But there'd also been the march of what they called Coxey's Army through the state that was led by a gentleman by the name of Hogan, where they borrowed a train in Butte and got as far as, I think, Forsyth before the U.S. troops stopped them. And so that kind of industrial unrest was kind of common at the time. There was probably, I don't know, a dozen or better large strikes in the state at that time as well. And strikes had a tendency to devolve into violence very quickly back then because it seemed like two things that folks always brought to a labor strike, a gun and a bomb. And they used them freely. So, you know, Stewart wasn't unaware of some of the issues that they faced. And in 1912, the strongest union community within the state, Butte, started to unravel itself with the creation of the rustling card system by the Anaconda Company that the union members didn't like. And that would play big 2 years later, right after Stewart's election as governor, when the Butte Miners Union, I guess you could say, imploded and exploded. It imploded upon itself. The rank and file members lost their confidence in the leadership, and as a consequence, they exploded their own union hall, and that prompted Governor Stewart to declare martial law in Butte. A couple of months after that, there was an Industrial Workers of the World invasion from the Dakotas into Montana that created quite a bit of excitement as well, what to do with this group of armed individuals that were invading the state. Governor Stewart even wrote to President Wilson requesting federal troops be stationed in Missoula through the winter to make sure that the violence would be contained and so forth. So there was a lot of reason to be uneasy as the United States marched closer to war. And it would ramp up pretty quickly once it started. Wilson had won re-election in 1916, basically running on the slogan that he kept us out of the war. But by 1916, it was pretty clear to Woodrow Wilson and most folks in the country that the United States was going to have to get involved at some point. One of the issues with getting involved was, which side do you choose? The United States had been supplying materials and so forth to Great Britain and her allies throughout the war so far, beginning in 1914. In some respects, because it was just easier to supply Great Britain than it was Germany. Britain controlled the seas. Germany had a fairly robust submarine warfare campaign going on that was successful, but they practiced restricted submarine warfare after the sinking of the Lusitania, so they were really careful about what shipping and so forth that they attacked. But by 1916, Wilson was pretty sure that they were going to have to get into the war, and so he was trying to prepare himself, his administration, and the American people about this war. But this wasn't a war like we're typically used to, where you have good versus evil in that sense. was a little muddier in this instance, and it complicated the issue in the fact that the United States had been taking in a huge number of immigrants for the last several years. And so by 1910, when they did the sentence, I've seen anywhere from a third to 25% of the population was foreign-born or had at least one parent that was foreign-born. And so that's a pretty large population that you have to convince to go to war on one side or the other. And so Wilson began kind of a clandestine war, I guess, if you will, or a propaganda campaign against the hyphenated American in order to prepare the country for war. In other words, we couldn't be German American and Irish American and Russian American anymore. We just had to be American, and we had to stand for a purpose and defend that purpose, even if it wasn't as clear as we would like it to be. And there was opposition to this, as you can imagine, when he went before Congress and asked for a declaration of war in April of 1917. It wasn't unanimous by any means. Jeanette Rankin wasn't the only one in the House of Representatives that voted no. There were 49 other representatives that voted no, and there were 6 U.S. senators who also voted no. And they did so for a number of reasons. For Jeanette Rankin and those on her side of the aisle that voted no on the war, she was a pacifist, and so she just didn't believe that there was any reason ever to go to war and waste the number of lives that they were seeing. And, you know, the war's 3 years in, 2.5 years in, and they're already seeing massive casualties for Germany and France and Russia and Great Britain, and the thoughts of putting American boys, American men in that type of situation was something that she just couldn't in good conscience do. And then there were others like Robert La Follette, who was a congressman from, I think, Wisconsin. And he believed that World War I was essentially a rich man's war and a poor man's fight. And how could you ask to conscript American soldiers who were primarily going to be from the poorer working class to go fight this war if you weren't going to ask the capitalists in the country to pay for it? And so he was opposed to the war on that notion. And then, of course, there were those who believed that we should have entered the war as soon as Europe went to war in 1914. Teddy Roosevelt was one of those individuals. Of course, Teddy Roosevelt never saw a war he didn't like. So he was one of those who believed early on that the best way to create American citizens was through the military camp, because that was one place that the class walls would be broken down. It didn't matter if you were rich or poor, if you were sleeping side by side in a tent on the field of battle, that would do more to promote democracy than anything else. So he was an early promoter of intervention in the war. They also saw this, Roosevelt and those like him also saw this as an opportunity to maybe redesign Europe and get rid of the old monarchy system and so forth, and maybe from the new world to the old, take our version of democracy to Europe and implant it there. So they weren't just fighting the Hun, they were fighting the old system of government as well, which they saw as corrupt. So it seemed to them like a good idea to go to war. Of course, that always excites xenophobia in these situations as well. And you see it to a lesser extent than we did in World War II with the Japanese, but the Germans were held in suspicion in this country as we got closer and closer to that declaration of war, and once war was declared. So there were issues about that. There were issues about anything that was considered foreign at the time. Enemy aliens were a big issue for them as well as they moved forward on this. So as Wilson is trying to prepare the country for war and asking for the declaration of war and receiving it, Governor Stewart on the home front is trying to prepare the state itself for war. War was declared a few weeks after the 1917 legislative session adjourned. So they essentially had not passed any laws or anything like that to help put Montana on a wartime footing. And that was something that was of concern to Stewart. It wasn't of concern enough that he thought that they should call a special session at this time, but there were things that he thought needed to be done. One of those was shortly after the declaration of war, he created the Montana Council of Defense. This was something that had happened on the national scene with the National Council of Defense, and the idea was that each state would create a Council of Defense as well, and within the state, the counties or parishes would create councils of defense, and those would be organizations that would help promote food production and industrial production and those types of things, and the buying of Liberty bonds to help pay for the war. And so Stewart went ahead and created a Montana Council of Defense, but it wasn't under any legislative authority. There was no statute for it. There was no appropriation for it. So he did what all good governors do. He borrowed money from other state agencies and funded his Council of Defense. But he also understood that it wasn't quite legal the way it was set up. The other thing that was of concern was how to handle the public reaction to the war, because all of a sudden Stewart was faced with home guards, local militias cropping up all over the state. These folks were gathering together because they believed that the threat of German sabotage was as powerful in Montana as it was anyplace else in the country, because of the wheat production that we had, because of the copper production, because of the timber and so forth. So it left us susceptible to attack internally, and with all the young men marching off to war, there needed to be somebody to defend the home front, correct? So local militias became an issue, and Stewart was concerned about these as well because, once again, he didn't have any legislative authority over that, and that's probably a weaker argument when you say it out loud, because quite frankly, they are governed by the law of the land, so their activities have to be within the realm of the law of the state of Montana. But he felt that there needed to be some kind of legislative authority over them as well to direct their actions. But again, it wasn't something that he saw as immediately necessary for a special session. The one thing that concerned him more than anything was the labor unrest in the state. 6 days after the United States declared war on Germany, 34 river drivers for the Eureka Lumber Company walked out on strike. And it doesn't sound like much of a big deal to us, but back in that time, it was a pretty big deal. Timber was declared an essential wartime material. Softwoods, especially spruce and white pine, were used in the construction of ships and airplanes. This was the days when airplanes were made out of wood and fabric and a lawnmower motor, so softwood was important. And the industrial workers of the world were the ones that were promoting the strike activity. They'd had a meeting in March of 1917 in Spokane, Washington, and organized the Lumber Workers Industrial Union number 500 with the strategy that they were going to strike the first timber company that started their Spring River Drive, and that happened to be the Eureka Lumber Company up in northwest Montana. And that was of concern enough because of Stewart's past knowledge of IWW activities in the state, and the fact that the gentleman managing the lumber company up there was named Charles Wheel, and he was a member of the legislature, and so he had the ear of the governor as well as Montana's 2 U.S. senators. So they began a pretty hard lobbying campaign to Senators Myers and Walsh, asking for federal troops to be sent to Eureka to break this strike as soon as possible. Now, they couldn't really claim that they were there to break the timber strike, so what they did was they folded around the notion that the Great Northern, which ran through Eureka, was a transcontinental railroad and therefore vitally important to the U.S. war effort, and so troops were needed to break the strike up so to make sure that the transcontinental line remained open. And they were successful at that. The first troops to be used during after the U.S. entry to World War I to break a strike were in Eureka. And they had good cause to be concerned about that timber strike because before it was over, it would spread from Eureka all the way to the Pacific Northwest coast. and there were anywhere between 50 and 75,000 loggers who were out on strike during a good chunk of World War I, to the extent that the federal government diverted troops from overseas and sent them to Washington State to the logging camps to harvest spruce for the war effort. They called them spruce soldiers. So it was a big deal. It was something to be concerned of. A few months later, you had the Granite Mountain Speculator mine fire in Butte that claimed the lives of 168 miners, and you had the creation of the Metal Mine Workers Union, which went out on strike asking for safer working conditions in the mines and maybe a pay increase, something that they hadn't seen in a while. So once again, Stewart's faced with these outside forces that he sees, because he doesn't view the labor unrest in Montana as something that occurred organically. He thinks that it's something that's been promoted by outside agitators, perhaps by German agents who are helping stir up the labor unrest to disrupt the wartime industries and so forth. And he's getting a lot of help with that theory from the general populace across the state, as well as the company press. At this time, the dailies are owned by, the daily newspapers in the state are owned by the Anaconda Company, and they are quick to label any labor disturbances in the state. They're quick to lay that at the feet of the IWW and claim that that's a foreign influence on the American worker, on the Montana worker, and that the Montana workers are actually loyal, they want to work, but they're being caught between a rock and a hard spot because the IWW is threatening them with violence if they return to work, and so they're not doing that, and so they're kind of caught in the middle of all of this. And how's the best way to deal with it? The other situation that they're facing with are draft riots. You have Butte, which is probably the most Irish town in the West at the time. They have a large Irish population that doesn't want to enlist in the U.S. military and fight on the side of Great Britain. It's the same situation with the Finns. Finland had been invaded by Russia, so the Finns in the country didn't want to be allied with Great Britain either. And of course, you had a large German population that believed that Germany was just as much in the right as anybody else, and why should they go to war against Germany? Because, again, the issues weren't that clear-cut for them. And so you can see that there's some turmoil going on, and he's going to have to deal with it at some point. It's just how to deal with it in a way that continues to promote industry, continues to promote the production of crops for the war effort and so forth, and cools the situation down instead of causing more violence. Unfortunately, that doesn't occur. In late July of 1917, Frank Little comes to Butte. He's just up from Arizona. He'd been down in Arizona at the copper mines there with the strike there around Bisbee. I think it's Phelps Dodge that owned the copper mine down in Arizona, and their way of handling the strike down in Arizona was to load up all the strikers on a train and ship them across the border into New Mexico and dump them in the desert. So, I mean, you know, just about anything's being used. So it's not just Montana that's experiencing labor unrest. I mean, there's quite a bit of labor unrest going on, especially in the Pacific Northwest and in the western states in the mining and timber industries. So Frank Little comes to Butte. His notion for coming to Butte is to try to pull the Metal Mine Workers Union into the IWW. This is something that the Butte miners don't want. They didn't advocate for, and they didn't encourage it whatsoever. Frank Little gave a couple of speeches while he was in Butte. Butte authorities asked U.S. Attorney Burton K. Wheeler to arrest Little for violating the 1917 Espionage Act. Burton K. Wheeler was a smart attorney. He also believed in the law, and the way he read the law, Frank Little had done nothing to warrant being arrested. He also understood that he was going to catch a lot of heat for that stance, so he invited the chief counsel for the Anaconda Company, L.O. Evans, to take a look at the Espionage Act and what Frank Little was being charged with and see if he could identify within the act where Frank Little had violated the law. And Evans had to reluctantly admit that there was nothing there that required Frank Little be arrested. It was, I think, the following evening that Little was kidnapped out of his boarding house room and beaten up and dragged behind a car and lynched on the outskirts of Butte. And there were those who would pick that story up and claim that if the espionage law had more teeth to it, Frank Little would have been arrested and thrown in jail, as opposed to honest, patriotic citizens having to take the law into their own hands to deal with him. It's a little bit of a bent way to look at it, but I guess it works. And when the federal government crafted the espionage law, they actually paid attention to what had occurred in 1798 with the Alien and Sedition Acts. And so they didn't want to be so repressive that anything could be construed as sedition or espionage. And so they had purposely left the law more open and not as rigid as it had been made in the past. And this was something that concerned the citizens of the state as well, as they watched these types of events unfold. And they were concerned about the strike activity, because you have strike activity in Butte, you have strike activity in the entire western portion of the Montana in the timber industry. You have strike activity in Washington and Oregon. So essentially, the West is on fire with labor strikes that are going on, to the extent that President Wilson sends west his Secretary of Labor, who's also named Wilson, but not Woodrow. It's a different Wilson. They're not related. He sends him west to investigate what's going on. At the same time, Governor Stewart enlists the assistance of his Department of Labor chief, Swindlehurst, to do an investigation of what's going on in the camps as well. Interesting enough, both come back and report the same thing. The grievances that the strikers had were legitimate. The food in the logging camps was horrible. The sleeping situations were horrible. There were no bathing facilities. There were for their clothing or for themselves. The sanitary conditions were a nightmare. Conditions in the mine were bad. Everybody was being forced to speed up, to get the rock in the box as quickly as possible, so safety issues were going out the window. So they sided with the strikers on that aspect of it. But then they said the fact that the IWW was the organization leading the strike, as far as they were concerned, it should be considered subversive and it needed to be broke. And so that's how they proceeded. And so Stewart decided that, yeah, there was going to have to be a special session of some sort in early 1918. So he begins crafting a proclamation to go out to the newspapers to alert the public that he is going to call a special session of the legislature to deal with some of these issues. And if you look at his correspondence in our governor's records, he's being swamped by telegrams and letters from all over the state about issues of labor unrest and the IWW and the Nonpartisan League, which is kind of the agrarian version of the IWW, and the rise of socialism, and what are they going to do about these saboteurs and these unpatriotic individuals going around saying bad things about the country and the soldiers and the president and so forth. He's also getting swamped with correspondence from the Women's Christian Temperance Union, who thinks it's a good idea to declare prohibition during war. He's also getting correspondence from the suffrage movement in the state. Although Montana had passed suffrage and Jeanette Rankin had been elected to Congress and so forth, it's still, there wasn't national suffrage in the country. And so they thought that there should be some type of national push for suffrage, and they thought Montana should push that since they had just recently adopted suffrage at home. So he's seeing a lot of mail about these types of things as he's crafting his proclamation for the special session. And shortly before he gives his speech before a joint session of the House, or before the legislature, he receives word of the sinking of the SS Tuscania off the coast of Scotland. The Tuscania is the first U.S. troop ship that was torpedoed by Germans during World War I. There were a little over 2,000, almost 2,400 U.S. Soldiers and sailors aboard the Tuscania when it went down. 210 individuals lost their lives. 7 of those were Montanans. And even though casualties for Montana had been fairly light up to this point, the newspapers, especially the Missoulian, played this up pretty big. I mean, it was important to the Missoulian because one of their hometown boys was on board the ship that went down, and he'd been a local track star, had been a student at the University of Montana when he enlisted, and so forth. So this really hit home as far as Governor Stewart was concerned. So something needed to be done. And again, he's receiving correspondence from across the state about that. One of my favorite letters is the one he received from W.F. Winkleman of Savage, Montana, who sent him clippings from the area newspapers that were supporting his decision to call a special session of the legislature. And it wasn't Winkleman's letter so much that tickled me. It was Governor Stewart's letter back to him, where he writes, "Your letter with the clippings has been received, and I'm glad to get the dope." This is a hip governor. He's got the dope. So it was good for him to hear that there was support for a special session as far as he was concerned. And his proclamation was pretty straightforward. He wanted to provide an amendment to the existing seed grain law. One of the major issues was the availability of seed grain for Montana farmers in order to plant the existing acreage that they had, but also to plant extra acreage that they were being encouraged to plant. And so something needed to be done to make seed grain more available to them through allowing counties to bond for this type of scenario. He also wanted to provide a moratorium for soldiers and sailors and to protect them from loss by legal procedures and statutes of limitation while they were serving overseas. He wanted to legalize the existence and maintenance of the State Council of Defense. Again, there had been no legislative law passed for the creation of the Council of Defense. There had been no legislative appropriation for it, so he needed to take care of that. He wanted to provide for the legal organization and maintenance of a home guard so that they would have state control of it rather than each home guard doing what they saw fit. He wanted to define sedition, treason, and disloyal utterances and acts and provide a punishment for those. They were tired of listening to people sound off in communities across Montana in opposition to the war. He wanted to define sabotage and criminal syndicalism, which is just a fancy way of they wanted to figure out a way to stop the labor strikes and end any violence that the labor unions might be using to achieve the goals of their strikes. The IWW was infamous for their tough talk, I guess if you will, about sabotage, and so there was quite a bit in the newspapers and coming from individuals like Charles Wheel and Fred Becker, who is the head of the Montana Lumber Manufacturers Association, about IWW instances of sabotage across the state, especially up around the Flathead, where there had been a number of suspicious fires and those types of things. Also wanted to provide a legal method where soldiers and sailors could vote absentee, which was something that they hadn't dealt with since the Civil War, and also to vote upon the question of the ratification of prohibition on a national level, so an amendment to the Constitution for prohibition. Again, why the urge to go dry during war just baffles me, but okay, you can do that if you want to, but there's going to be a lot of unhappy soldiers, right? Unless you make it to France where you can get some wine. On February 14th, Governor Stewart addressed a joint session of the Senate and the House and asked for them to confer on the issues that he had highlighted in his proclamation. During that special session, at the beginning of that special session, he had pointed out that the legislature in 1917 had adjourned in March and hadn't given them time to. The country hadn't been at war, and so that they hadn't had time to prepare Montana for it. And so his hope was to keep this as short as possible and to work as quickly as possible to achieve the necessary laws to put Montana on a full wartime setting. Because at this time, nobody was sure exactly how much longer the war was going to last. Most of the pundits during the this time period, figured even with the U.S. entry into the war, because it was going to take a while for the U.S. to get fully engaged in the war effort, that the war would probably last until about 1920. So this, as far as they were concerned, was going to last a while, and so there needed to be some business taken care of. As I mentioned, seed grain was one of the biggest issues that that Stewart faced in regards to the special session. The Montana Council of Defense had been urging farmers across Montana to increase the amount of land under tillage. They were encouraging Montana state banks to take high-risk loans with these farmers so that they could increase the amount of land that they had under cultivation, and as well as provide them with extra money so that these farmers could purchase more seed for the planting, because they were going to need grain for the war effort, to feed U.S. soldiers, but also to feed those folks in Europe who had already been at war for almost 4 years. So the Montana farmer was going to play a huge role in that. And you know, some of the issues that they were concerned about, an example is this letter from Orville Stanberry of Guilford, Montana, who wrote the governor just before the start of the special session. I see by the present law a man cannot get seed unless he has a patent to his land, unless this is amended to apply to all class of farmers, it will not help the homesteaders any. For instance, my own case, I have a homestead and am renting one section, and under the present law, I could not get a bushel of seed. So there needed to be something done to help them with that situation. And that was one of the first things that the legislature addressed. They adopted House Bill 10, which allowed counties to incur debt in order to provide seed grain for the farmers in the area, whether they rented or owned the land. They also addressed the lien on growing crops and grain threshed, again, so that they could increase the amount of production. And they appropriated $500,000 for the Montana Council of Defense. And that, in large part, was to help support the Council of Defense in its mission to promote Montana's wartime industries and help them move forward with meeting their production limits as they arose. In terms of suffrage, it never did fall completely off the books, although it was something. Suffrage and prohibition were two of the things that Stewart really wasn't interested in having the session deal with at all. And as a matter of fact, his early responses to those who were asking for something along those lines was, we have more important things to discuss at this moment and to take care of. So I think we should just put those by the wayside and we'll deal with them later on. By the time he called the special session, he'd received enough mail from across the state that there was no way that he could politically leave it off the agenda for the special session. So for suffrage, what they did was they passed a House Joint Memorial that basically said that the United States, or that Montana supported the adoption of an amendment to the U.S. Constitution for the ratification and extending of suffrage to all the women in the nation, and that was how they took care of that. As far as the sobriety issue, I love the pamphlet from the Montana Club, A Few Snorts Before We Go Dry. So they addressed that as well, and like I said, he received telegrams, mostly telegrams, from chapter presidents of the Women's Christian Temperance Union from across Montana, literally from Ekalaka to Libby. These folks were just inundating him, and of course they were claiming that grain was a wartime essential for feeding the soldiers and feeding those folks in Europe. And so how could they in good conscience divert grain to the production of alcohol, which wouldn't feed anybody, as opposed to food to feed the hungry? And so for them, it was a wartime necessity to have prohibition. Montana had adopted prohibition on a limited level, so Governor Stewart, being the good progressive that he was at the time, endorsed some sort of resolution that would would promote prohibition on the national level as well. And so again, they passed a joint resolution encouraging the federal government to adopt an amendment to the Constitution for national prohibition. And I like the way it says, prohibiting the manufacture, sale, and transportation of intoxicating liquors. You could hear Kessler cry. And even though the seed lien law was one of the primary motivators of the special session, they spent a lot of time working on the sedition aspect of it. Now, the interesting thing about what they ended up doing with the sedition bill was that it was actually Montana Senator Henry Myers' repurposed bill that he'd introduced at the federal level the year before, and it didn't make it out of committee. So essentially what they did was they dusted off Myers' federal law, and Montana instituted it for the state sedition law. And then the federal government would actually adopt the same thing later on in 1918. And again, there's a lot of people asking for him to do something along these lines. And again, all across the state, from Highwood to the Eureka Patriotic League, to the Libby Patriotic League. I mean, these folks are anxious about those individuals who are on 100% behind the war. And so something needs to be done about it. Lee Ford, who was president of the Great Falls National Bank, wrote Stewart expressing his concerns about what's happening in the Great Falls area, where it looked like the local union, the Central Labor Council, was going to create its own home guard. And this was disturbing to Ford, because as far as he was concerned, and from the rumors that he was hearing, that, yeah, the Central Labor Council was going to create a home guard to protect the home front, but during this special session, they were going to call a general strike and shut down the industries in Great Falls. So something had to be done about these types of situations to halt them in their tracks, rather than allow them to get legs. Again, Frank Little was used as an example of the weakness of the Espionage Act and why they needed something that required a stiffer penalty for those who spoke out against the country. W.M. Woolbridge of Hinsdale in Valley County, Montana, wrote this rather impassioned letter to Stewart, stating, "We are at war. Some damnable things are being done. We have no militia. Something must be organized to take the place of our sons now in France. And what's more fitting than that the fathers of these sons perform that duty at home." And so he also had some suggestions for the labor unrest that was going on in the state as well. He believed that they should lift the ban on Chinese immigration and bring in Chinese workers to work industry in Montana, and just tell the labor unions to go lay down by their bull. That didn't happen, but it was a suggestion. So it shows that there wasn't a lot of support for striking workers during a time of war, as you can imagine, and they wanted to see those strikes end. There was opposition to a sedition law. Some of it came from the labor front. The Central Labor Council in Deer Lodge was concerned about the sedition laws that were going to be passed. It looked like they were aimed primarily at silencing labor unions and their ability to strike and demand the redress of grievances with companies and so forth. And so they actually asked Stewart to hold off signing any labor or any sedition law until after they'd sent a delegation there to talk to him about their side of the problem. That was something that Stewart was essentially unwilling to do. The other issues they saw was the State Council of Carpenters had two members who had been in the legislature in 1917, and they were concerned that the voice of labor wouldn't be heard in that special session because those two individuals had signed up and were in the military now, and so their seats were vacant. And so they wanted Governor Stewart to appoint two more individuals from the labor side of the issue to the legislature so that they could provide some balance to the debate that was going on. And Stewart assured him that he had enough legislators as is to have a full quorum and be able to do that without replacing anybody. So again, Stewart didn't have a lot of sympathy for what was going on with the industry at the time, whether they were loggers or miners. He was also pretty vexed with the I like that word, vexed. That's my word of the day, vexed. He was vexed with the farmers in Montana. I'll stop saying it, because the farmers, as far as he was concerned, were getting a little too big politically for their britches, and they were falling under the influence of the Nonpartisan League. And the Nonpartisan League had come out of the Dakotas, and essentially it advocated for national control of the transportation system, the railroads, and the grain elevators and so forth to control prices. Because as far as the farmer was concerned, they were getting robbed by the railroads and by the grain elevator companies of any profits that they were seeing from their crops. And for the first time, they were actually seeing some pretty substantial profits in terms of their grain production, because the federal government had actually inflated the price per bushel and was holding the price steady. And so, this was an opportunity for them to make some serious money. Of course, nationalizing the transportation system, nationalizing the grain elevators and so forth, that was seen as socialism. And with what was going on in Europe with the war and the rise of the Bolsheviks in Russia in the fall and winter of 1917, there was more and more unease about these foreign influences being unleashed in the country. And so Stewart wanted to do what he could to silence these folks as well. And he had support about that decision as well, about the activities. As a matter of fact, he addressed a large gathering of farmers in Great Falls just before the special session, and got into a bit of a shouting match with some of those individuals that he assumed were members of the Nonpartisan League. And so he didn't refer to them as members of the Nonpartisan League. What he called them were agitators in IWW. The IWW seemed to be the scapegoat for just about everything that was going wrong at this time. And so his hope was that the legislature would pass something that would deal with that situation and teach the farmer that just because they had a growing presence and vote in the state, they didn't get to have everything that they demanded. He was also concerned with the passage of the sedition law about how that was going to be put into action. And so in his opening speech, he actually stated, "Care should be taken that no machine be created for the oppression of the innocent. The law should be plain and unequivocal, but should be so drawn that its provisions cannot be misapplied or its operation turned aside to the accomplishment of an unworthy purpose." So he did have some qualms about the sedition law and how that was going to unfold. But the sedition law passed very quickly through the legislature. Senate Bill 1 was an act providing for the creation and appointment of the Council of Defense. So now not only did they have money, but they were also legislatively mandated. Senate Bill 2 defined criminal syndicalism and the word sabotage, and prohibited the teaching or suggestion of overthrow of the government by violent means and so forth. House Joint Resolution 1 memorialized Congress to pass legislation defining as a crime and providing punishment for all acts of individuals, associations, corporations, or partnerships done or attempted to be done that may be construed as seditious or sabotage. And this was aimed directly at the IWW. As a matter of fact, the federal government had already taken steps to eliminate the IWW menace in the country. In the fall of 1917, they started raiding IWW halls across the West, arresting the leadership, and they put them on trial in Chicago in 1918, where I think just about every single one of them were convicted of treason and sentenced anywhere from 5 to 25 years in the federal penitentiary. And that essentially broke the back of the IWW. A resolution to to review the labor situation, not only in the state of Montana, but also the Northwest. Like I said, this wasn't something that just happened in the bubble that was Montana. This went well beyond our borders, and this is one of the reasons why it created so much agitation and tension, is because nobody knew exactly how widespread this was going to be. And if they could have a revolution in Russia, we could have a revolution here, and what would that look like? And, you know, we have to do what we can to preserve our democracy. House Bill 6 was aimed at ending desecration of the flag, and House Bill 15 basically said you couldn't transport or build your own explosive materials. Montana's a mining state. Dynamite's kind of a fact of life. They also created a registry for firearms for enemy aliens or alien immigrants, to where they had to have to go into the local sheriff's office and register their firearms and note how many that they'd had. So the idea behind the special session wasn't necessarily to repress free speech or end, I guess, civil disobedience, if you will. And maybe it was to end civil disobedience, because there was a feeling during the war that there was a thing that they called indirect treason. And it was something that came from a Stanford University professor. His name was Ephraim. Anthony's over there nodding his head. You remember his last name, Anthony? No. I'll blame that on Anthony. Anyway, it came from California there. Well, yeah, Jeff came from California too, but we like Jeff. And essentially it said that those organizations or groups like the socialists or the flat taxers that wouldn't put aside their agenda during this time of war were indirectly committing treason. And so this was something that took hold in the country to the extent that even purchasing Liberty bonds became a testament to your patriotism. If the local Council of Defense believed that you hadn't purchased your fair share of Liberty bonds, they would pay you a visit and literally knock on your door and ask you why you hadn't purchased more bonds, and that it would behoove you to do so as soon as possible. So very interesting times, and you know, this issue of trying to make America 100% American, and end this notion that the country is a nation of immigrants. You know, the idea is that we were going to come through this war, and we're going to come through on the other side, and there wasn't going to be any more hyphenated Americans. They were just going to be Americans, and everybody would understand fully what patriotism was all about. So at the conclusion of the special session, Stewart believed that they had actually accomplished what they could to stabilize Montana's industry and the work situation and the situation for the farmers. And he believed that overall Montana was in a better place. But as we know, history is full of surprises and unintended consequences, and those unintended consequences are what would unfold over the next several months in the state as the war proceeded until November of 1918. But the effects of that war and the preparation for that war was something that Montana would have to deal with for another generation. The country would have to deal with for another generation, and I would argue that we're still dealing with the ripple effect of the things that were done during World War I. November 1918, the war ends, so the sedition law should be over, correct? Montana signs Governor Stewart signs a sedition law that doesn't have the sentence in at about the nation having to be at war. So any utterance against the United States, regardless of whether we're at war or not, becomes a question of sedition, of treason. The federal government's sedition and espionage laws drop off the books on Woodrow Wilson's last day in office. Montana's sedition law would stay as law until 1973, when, interesting enough, Duke Crowley, who was an attorney, worked with the legislature to get it taken out of statute. And Crowley was interesting because he was the grandson of the attorney that defended Vess Hall before Judge Borkin. And Vess Hall was charged with violating the treason, the Espionage Act for his utterances about the war, and he hoped that the United States lost and that Germany won, and Vess Hall's case and Judge Borkin's ruling on that case, where he basically acquitted him, were one of the primary movers for the federal sedition law that was passed later in 1918. So things are, very connected. And as a result of what occurred because of the seed grain law and the banks extending credit to farmers who were already overextended, by 1926, half the farms in Montana are abandoned, and half the state banks are bankrupt. So again, unintended consequences. This isn't something that Stewart or those individuals who came together in February of 1918 foreseen. But it's what happens. And so we have to be careful with our history and how we proceed and how we define things.
Ta-da!
Nothing else to